My name is Stephanie Nawyn. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-director of academic programs at the Center for Gender and Global Context and the moderator for this panel titled Women Empowering Women, Engaging a Feminist Mentorship Model in the Academy. I'm going to be introducing the first speaker on our panel, and then Dr. Clark, and then Dr. Clark will introduce her co-presenters. I just want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded. So just something to keep in mind, we've got a lot of requests to show these panels, later, make them available for streaming for folks who couldn't fit the specific time slot into their schedule. So please keep that in mind. I'm going to ask that everyone who isn't a presenter just keep your mic muted and your video off so that everyone can kind of see our presenters as if they were in a physical room, in a physical space where it's a new world organization, new world conference. So it is my delight to introduce Dr. Dessie Clark, who is a research collaboration coordinator for the advanced program at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Dr. Clark completed her PhD in community sustainability at Michigan State University. In her current role at UMass, Dr. Clark's work focuses on institutional transformation for women and underrepresented minorities in STEM fields. Specifically, she explores the ways in which equitable collaborations can foster a climate of inclusion that leads to better outcomes for faculty members. So I will pass the mic off to you, Dr. Clark, and let me know if you need anything. We will have some time for Q&A afterwards, so please, you can raise your hand or just put questions in the chat function, and we'll keep an eye on those.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So since this presentation is about mentorship, Stephanie was one of my mentors and one of my committee members. So just a little shout out at the beginning of this. So we're going to be talking about mentorship, feminist mentorship, specifically in the academy. So my name is Dr. Dessie Clark. I'm joined by Dr. Kelley Millenbah, who is of Michigan State, and then Sidney Brandhorst, who is of Arizona State University.
What we'd like to do before we get started is talk a little bit about what the agenda will look like today. So first of all, we'll start with an overview of the feminist mentoring theory, and then we will spend some time talking through the case study that involves the three of us, including why our case is unique, a little bit more about us, the lessons we've learned, and outcomes. And then we'll do Q&A at the end and open it up for hopefully a nice discussion with the group that's here today.
Right, so before we get started, it's really important for us to situate ourselves in kind of context with the work that we're going to be talking about. So we're all white female scholars, and we note the privilege from which we stand, particularly as white women. So I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm cisgender, white. I identify as having a disability, and also being a survivor of both sexual and institutional violence.
And I refer to myself as she, her, hers, cisgender, white, atheist, and an ally.
And I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I am cisgender, white, and I identify as a Christian.
So we're going to just jump right into talking about some of the foundational literature. So feminist principles are rooted in feminist values, specifically those values of accessibility, equity, justice, and inclusion. So feminist principles, when we apply that to mentoring, can improve the depth and breadth of the academic community and also improve the climate in the academy. So what do we mean by these terms? So when we're talking about accessibility, we mean this broadly. So this means that everyone has access to what they need, whether it be resources, movements, basically the quality of being easy to obtain or use. Equity, that's the quality of being fair and impartial. By justice, we mean just behavior or treatment. And as far as inclusion, we're talking about the action or state of including or being included within a group or a structure. So in Cram's work from 1985, she talks about how mentoring consists of two functions. The first is career and prepping individuals for a career, and psychosocial support, such as providing emotional support. So mentoring research in a variety of contexts supports the existence of these two main functions of mentoring. So the concept and process of mentoring raises some interesting issues for feminist educators. Mentoring is intended to socialize individuals into a pre-existing environment, and this can intentionally or unintentionally reproduce a system of inequality. So one issue for feminist mentors is this paradoxical nature of feminist mentoring. So on one hand, feminist educators question mentoring relationships because they recognize that these relationships may socialize people into these pre-existing systems of inequality. They can also assist in reinforcing and maintaining these systems. In academia, the maintenance of inequality can be seen through this non-inclusive and non-contextual interaction. So basically framing people only within their work, only within their research, and not paying attention to hierarchies, informal and impersonal interactions. There's a lot of lack of attention given to how people's personal lives and the things that are happening to them personally may intersect with their work and school experiences and how they kind of navigate the world. So feminists want to change these aspects of academia. And so traditionally, feminists have challenged these mentoring relationships because of the fact that they reinforce inequality. So it's really important to consider how feminists mentor students, graduate students, each other into the very status quo that they're challenging. So with any type of mentoring, this focus on feminist mentoring isn't just about mentoring and research. So it extends into encouragement and nurturing and general care to students that are immersed in a professional environment but are still living their personal lives. And so feminist mentoring can also include this role modeling of how to blend personal and professional. So feminist mentoring wants to pay more careful attention to issues of power and to issues in the psychosocial environment and role modeling functions to demonstrate what it's like to be a feminist in both your personal life and your professional life. So Tom, in their 1997 paper, described the framing of deliberate relationships. So the ways in which faculty members acknowledge the responsibilities of being in a position of authority in relation to students, while also working with them to challenge and question and redistribute power to the fullest possible extent. So attention to both the personal lives and the professional lives might include things like disclosure around personal issues, power issues, basically the ways in which faculty can disclose, or people with more power can disclose, aspects of their personal life benefits the relationships in the professional sphere. So building upon an approach to therapy, which is called the relational cultural theory, it's a theory of human development and also a therapeutic modality. And it emphasizes the belief that individuals grow in connection with one another and that both parties benefit from the relationship. So this mentoring framework that you see on the screen is developed by Fletcher and Raggins from their 2007 paper, and it applies some core concepts from RCT that include relational conditions, stance, skills, behaviors, and processes. It also includes contextual factors and mentoring episodes and relationship outcomes. So this is clearly in stark contrast to traditional models of mentoring. As you can see, this is more of a horizontal approach. It's less formal, less hierarchical, and it has these interpersonal dynamics built into it. And it is also based on this really important underlying assumption that one person, that people have things to offer each other, that there isn't one person that inherently has more to offer than another. So when we're thinking about this in the academic context, for example, it's often assumed that senior faculty members or people that are more seniors know more than people that are less experienced. And therefore that person should serve in the mentor role, regardless of other factors, to contribute to a successful mentoring relationship. An issue with this, as you can assume, is the built-in power dynamic. So this can limit the degree of trust that a junior person has and may limit the utility of the relationship. If a mentee doesn't feel like they can be honest or that they can be transparent, that will inhibit the ways in which the relationship can be productive. So like I've said several times now, the literature is focused a lot on this formal and hierarchical mentoring, but it's also paid more attention to ongoing mentoring and less attention to mentoring episodes. So mentoring episodes are shorter periods of mentorship that may come up in a mentor or mentee's professional relationships. So these mentoring episodes may be unexpected. They're not always understood or appreciated in the moment. Oftentimes, they're more appreciated upon reflection. But these mentoring episodes can provide a safety net for people that are involved. So mentoring episodes are more likely to evolve into high-quality mentoring relationships when both of the members have the ability to resist the prescribed roles and adopt a relational stance. So orthodox mentoring practices really aim to keep these institutional and individual power hierarchies intact. And feminists, especially radical feminists with radical mentoring approaches, seek to participate in institutional change and institutional transformation. So this feminist mentorship model seeks to upend these cultures and myths of achievement that reinforce hierarchies and erase or devalue people as people. So central to this feminist model is this recognition of mentoring as an act of care, with a primary goal of challenging these cultural and structural barriers for people. And valuing this care work is important to the process. One of the issues, though, is this idea of care, the care dilemma. So we know that caring can be really helpful in supporting other women, people of color, first-generation college students. But one of the problems with care work, especially as feminist women, is that often this is seen as a distraction from more serious work of scholarship. So people that, and women specifically, that participate in this care work are reinforcing rather than challenging the gender stereotypes and roles. So we may want to be challenging this kind of collective entrenchment of these oppressive values, but in the process, we're adding to our workload, we're taking on more tasks than our male colleagues, and we're assuming that traditional gendered role of woman as caretaker. So care work is important, and it can help in a holistic mentoring way challenge the dehumanizing effects of the university. But at the same time, even among feminist communities, co-mentoring is really necessary. So one of the things that's really important is that we all need this ongoing mentoring. So this isn't just something that faculty members should think about with graduate students, or senior faculty members should think about with junior faculty. We all need ongoing mentoring, and we need that ongoing mentoring about mentoring. So we can't change the institution if we're still clinging to this old model of mentoring. If not done right, which I think many of us know and we'll talk about here, mentoring can be ineffective, but also really alienating. One way to kind of think about this is something that the FemMentee Collective calls self-peerceptive feminist mentoring. So it's defined as the pedagogical process of self-reflexive co-mentorship in which people at different career stages critically reflect on and share their experiences of navigating the academy, and then also analyze the emotional registers of these biographical stories to gain insight into institutional systems of power. And our case study today is an example of that kind of mentoring. One of the things I want to highlight before we move on to our case study is that one of the best kinds of mentoring is not only informal mentoring, but stealth mentoring. So this happens when we don't realize it. It can happen in casual conversations with colleagues or students. Our bodies are the site of this mentoring because we mentor by doing, and what we choose to do matters. This mentoring happens all the time. It happens in various places and spaces, but often it's invisible. So we also recognize, though, that while informal and stealth mentoring is really important, it can also exclude those without access to the networks through which these power and expertise moves. So this informal and stealth mentoring is usually a product of luck, being in the right place at the right time with the right people. But that luck is also built on this premise of being privileged enough to be in these spaces to begin with. So we're going to talk a little bit today about the ways in which all of these things have been a part of our experiences. So not just feminist mentoring, informal mentoring, stealth mentoring, the ways in which the care work has been important, why holistic mentoring matters. And we're going to also walk you through what our definition of feminist mentoring is and what we think that other people can take from this to bring into their own spaces to try and enact some of this.
So why do we consider this case unique? Generally, mentors and mentees tend to be matched based on their similarities. Especially in the academy, mentors tend to be within the mentee's discipline. However, ours is a case of 3 women playing both the role of mentor and mentee from various disciplines, including biology, psychology, and sustainability. While there are some benefits to having a mentor-mentee relationship within one discipline, we'll argue that the transdisciplinary relationships are exceptionally beneficial, potentially more than those between persons who share essentially the same similarities. In fact, transdisciplinarity allows for idea sharing, broadening of knowledge, and pushes for mentors and mentees to relate on a more personal level. Case studies of mentoring generally involve the relationship between two people, but here we have a chain of 3 mentors and mentees. This allows us to think about a person who's in a mentoring role, a person who takes both roles, and a person who's primarily a mentee. But in the end, all 3 of us were simultaneously mentors and mentees. As we alluded to in our introduction of ourselves, and you'll hear more later about us, we are also 3 women from very different generations with varied experiences, values, contexts. And these differences essentially allow for us to have even richer mentoring experiences. And while our relationships began and have taken root well before COVID-19, the pandemic has given us another space to navigate in our own mentoring relationships. Our existing relationships provided support for each of us as we transitioned to lives mostly lived, working at home, and mainly online.
So Kelly touched on this a little bit in the previous slide, but now we're going to talk about the participants in this case study and their roles in relationships with one another. And so first, who are we? We have Kelly Millenbah, who is at the top. She is the Senior Associate Dean of the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources at MSU and has been trained as a biologist. Next is Dessie, who is pictured the leftmost. She was a PhD student at MSU and now is the Research Collaboration Coordinator at the University of Massachusetts, and her background is in psychology. And my name is Sidney. My picture is at the bottom, and I recently finished up my undergraduate degree at MSU and am now a PhD student at Arizona State University, and my background is in the field of sustainability. So as you can see, we all have very different training and are in very different places in our careers. And so you might be wondering how this all happened. And so now I'm going to hand it back to Dessie so she could talk about that.
Yeah, so how did this happen? We all come from very different spaces. And I'll touch on this a little bit more. When I was a PhD student at Michigan State University, ended up in a situation where I worked for a mentor that participated in what I believe to be a series of issues of misconduct. And one of those types of misconduct that I believe to be reporting was research misconduct. And so as I was navigating the reporting process, I interacted with the Research Integrity Office. In that space, Kelly was assigned to me as an advocate or a counsel to help me navigate the process. In around the same time that all this was happening, or shortly thereafter, Sidney was working in an office that Kelly was overseeing. And I was in desperate need of a research assistant to help me finish up my dissertation so I could finish my PhD. Kelly introduced me and Sidney. Sidney was an amazing fit for my project. And so as Kelly says, the rest is history. That was kind of what began these mentor and mentee relationships.
So I just want to let everybody know before I go, I'm having a little connectivity problem, so I'm going to keep my video off, but hopefully you can hear me a little bit more clearly. So I wanted to just share with you a little bit more about what my previous experience has been with mentorship. In my life, I have had good and bad mentors, and I have been a good and a bad mentor. It is my life journey and my willingness to get outside of my comfort zone that has allowed the scales to tip later in my career more heavily to having good mentors and also being a good mentor and mentee. As a faculty member, I have had the privilege of mentoring graduate and undergraduate students throughout my career. In the early days of my career, I would not classify myself as a strong feminist mentor. I had mostly been mentored by men in a male-dominated discipline. When I joined the faculty, I was one of only 2 women in my unit. my feminist role models were few and far between. I've also served as a formal and informal, and in some cases a stealth mentor to faculty and staff throughout my career. Interestingly, but likely not surprisingly, as I have become more established in my career and taken on greater leadership roles, my role as a stealth mentor has increased dramatically. Personally, I have also had formal and informal mentors. One of my greatest mentors was actually my former college advisor, who mentored me up until his death a couple of years ago. I also had a very formal mentoring committee when I was a faculty member, and I also had a stealth mentor as I was a faculty member moving into administration, and continue to have a stealth mentor. One of my other benefits that I have right now is a fabulous supervisor who is a trusted mentor for me, as well as several key members of our staff who are mentors to me, and I mentor them in concert.
So I have also had a variety of good and bad mentoring relationships. So as far as a mentor, I have been a graduate student mentor to undergraduate students such as Sidney. I've also been a graduate student peer mentor. So I have mentored graduate students that are more early in their graduate school trajectory, both at the institution I was at and at other ones. I also have had formal and informal mentors. And I would say that honestly, informal mentors probably make up more of my network than formal mentors. So as I described to you, I did not have a great mentoring relationship with my first PhD advisor. And while I was able to change advisors and find a great formal mentor and a great committee that was very supportive of me, I also experienced mentorship by a variety of faculty members at other institutions. I was able to really use the formal mentorships in my life to connect with other faculty members, other graduate students, to really act as mentors for me as I finished my PhD process and now into beyond that in my postdoctoral career.
So I would say that I've definitely had much more experience as a mentee than a mentor. When I think about my experiences as a mentee, some of the first relationships that come to mind are those that began when I was an undergraduate at Michigan State. And they stand out in my head because these relationships were pretty formal, and it was pretty clear that these were mentor-mentee relationships. And the reason that I engaged in these relationships were because of a research project that I was on, and besides a little bit of small talk, that was pretty much the extent of those relationships and conversation that was had. And so with that, I would like to say that although this presentation is going to advocate for less traditional forms of mentoring, the relationships I just described were also really important in my development as a student and as a researcher. And so I don't want to discount their value. But I also experienced being in a less formal mentorship where I was mentored by someone who also identifies as a Christian. And this was a much different type of relationship because this person mentored a whole different side of me. And I've also had a tiny bit of experience in the mentor role. When I was an undergraduate at Michigan State, I was involved in a Christian organization called Young Life, and the main goals of Young Life are to build relationships with students and help them take steps in their faith. And so as a Young Life leader, I just spent a lot of time at JV basketball games and going to high school drama productions. And so these were really informal relationships, but they helped me to learn the importance of building rapport and consistency in a mentee's life.
So now I want to talk a little bit about relevancy before we really get into the nitty-gritty of how we define feminist mentorship. So for the way we see it, mentoring is the backbone of the academy. Although it's not in formal job descriptions for faculty or staff or even students, mentoring is an important role that many in the academic context play. We know that academia is a complex landscape. Mentorship and support are really important in this academic space because it's complicated and challenging to navigate, especially for those who are newer. So for women specifically, it's also important to support one another in a place that's traditionally patriarchal. That's a really important component of feminist mentorship. Mentoring is also good for institutions, although sometimes I'm not sure that they realize that. It aids in student and faculty retention and success. So when someone feels supported in their space, in whatever space they're in, they tend to have greater successes and stay in a job or a program. As I mentioned, mentoring is for everybody. It's not just for students or those who are early in their career, it's also for seasoned administrators like Kelly. As Kelly mentioned previously, she's had mentors both inside and outside of the academy since becoming a faculty member and even an administrator. So it's really important that we all have some type of mentor in our lives. Being a mentee is not something that we should be growing out of. There's also a need for mentoring resources, and we touched on this a little bit, but not much attention is paid towards mentor training. So generally the tasks of mentoring are not in job descriptions, and faculty and staff are not formally trained on how to mentor well. This can lead to relationships that reinforce these problematic power dynamics or have negative impacts. So mentoring training and resources, and even just conversations about mentoring, should be available to ensure the maximum benefit from these relationships. So although we've gone through some of the theory of feminist mentorship in the beginning, there is going to be a little bit of overlap between the theory and the list. So it's important to remember how we go through the rest of this presentation is how we're defining feminist mentorship and drawing from our own experiences. Some of that ties explicitly to the literature I presented, some of it does not. So the key components of feminist mentorship that we are going to talk about in more detail are that feminist mentorship is horizontal, reciprocal, collaborative. It dismantles exploitive processes. It's affirming. It fosters transparency, authenticity, and trust. It welcomes feedback and correction. It involves open and honest conversation. It has holistic support, and it's reflective and reflexive. So talking first about structure. So I have talked a bit about traditional mentoring and how it's a top-down model, a more vertical approach. Feminist mentoring is a little bit more of a co-mentoring model. So this is different because it has the ability to foster a more mutual and collaborative relationship. So it's a more horizontal relationship. This is where some of the biggest differences between feminist mentoring and traditional methods of mentoring occur. More traditional mentoring employs a power differential between two people. And while that power differential is still there in feminist mentoring relationships, there's an active intention to at least mitigate some of that power. So along the same lines, it's a reciprocal relationship. So the idea of reciprocity is more of a relates more to the horizontal component. So it means that this relationship can be mutually beneficial. So both parties can learn from one another rather than receiving all of the benefit. Whereas a more traditional mentoring model is unidirectional and relies on this thought that the person that's more senior at the top has something to benefit the more junior person, and it doesn't go both ways. So we're going to be talking about examples throughout all of our presentation. And here I think it's really important to talk about this in two different ways. So for Sidney and I, this looked very much like being more collaborative in our research. So when we were having issues with my research project, which was my dissertation, we did a lot of talking to one another. We did a lot of decision-making jointly. And there was also this phenomenon that occurred where we were really learning things from each other. There were definitely things about the research process that I was able to teach Sidney, but she also taught me a lot about communication and how best to communicate to people that I'm supervising or working with in the future. With Kelly and I, we operated mostly outside of a research setting in these more informal spaces, the reporting process being the biggest one. And so in this, we really navigated some of these offices together and learned a lot from one another. So while we were working together, there were often things that she would bring to the table as an administrator, I would bring together as a student, and we're able to really work together to teach each other things about these processes, to not just make the most of the process as we were going through it, but also to really work hard at the university level to make concrete changes in policy and procedure. So this again ties into the former two slides, but the idea of feminist mentoring is that it should be collaborative. And we mean this, of course, in the scientific sense, but also outside of that as well. So collaborations are a co-production of knowledge. So having different perspectives in the room, particularly perspectives that complement one another, can really benefit research projects or processes. Also, we know that collaboration in a research setting is really a best practice. This is something that funders look for, that is really helpful in writing papers or producing any of the academic products that we all kind of think about. It also helps build integrative capacity. So the integrative capacity is something that is argued to help facilitate the social and cognitive interaction processes that are necessary for an effective team. This enhances the likelihood of innovation and team outcomes. Collaboration also focuses on quality over quantity. So the quality of a collaboration matters. Thinking more about what you're doing, what the inputs of that might be, versus doing more. Doing more is not always a metric of success. Sometimes a quality product is definitely more of a successful outcome than doing more of something. So as I brought up before, we really see this collaboration around research in me and Sidney's relationship. We worked hard together to do a variety of different things between writing papers and grant writing and just working through data collection, data analysis, data cleaning. And there was a lot of compromise and conversation that happened around those things. And there was a lot of times where one of us would think of something or contribute something that the other one hadn't. And it really made that project a lot better. As I mentioned with Kelly, a lot of this happened in reporting offices. So for example, there was one process that we were going through where there was some question about what was the correct procedure for completing comprehensive examinations. I had my understanding as a student, and Kelly had her understanding as a administrator. And it became clear that we both had an understanding that was very different from the office that we were working with. We were able to come together and put both sides of this experience together to help inform the office on the correct procedures for comprehensive examinations. And with that collaboration, we were able to make change. Whereas I think if we had approached it individually, we wouldn't have really been able to give the whole picture to the office that we were working with.
Another tenet of how we are defining feminist mentoring is related to the role of dismantling exploitive practices that hopefully lead to transformation within the academy. This requires that we are constantly reflecting on our experiences and dismantling those practices in a system while also belonging in it and bringing others into it. So I want to share 3 examples with you across the 3 of us that we experienced that hopefully point to how we work to dismantle some of these exploitive practices. When Sidney first started graduate school, she was not real familiar with what the norms were around graduate teaching assistantships and research assistantships. She was first assigned to be a TA for the class, but then essentially the number of students in the class was short, which meant she might also have to take on a research assistantship in her first semester as a grad student. In her conversations with Dessie, where Dessie was able to advise her on issues of what made sense and what was likely right, she was able to work through essentially ensuring that Sidney was not taken advantage of as a part of her research and teaching assistantships. Dessie's alluded a lot to the work that she and I did together involving some of the challenges that she faced as a graduate student at the university. And through that, because we worked with the research integrity, human subjects, our office of and others, we actually were able to push for change in a variety of those offices because of lack of understanding, lack of clarity around who had responsibility, etc. In another case that involves Sidney, we found out that from Sidney that she was having some challenges with a supervisor in a workplace, and it was a very toxic environment. Because Sidney raised the issue with Dessie and encouraged Sidney to talk with me about it, we were able to move Sidney out of a very toxic space and hopefully into a much more supportive environment for her work. What's important to recognize in these examples is that while they may seem unidirectional at times or generally only between 2 people, in fact, we were constantly working across the 3 of us. We talked with one another, we shared, we learned, and then we grew simultaneously.
We also thought it was important to talk about affirmation. And while that might be maybe a more obvious one, it's really important. And so this means to be someone who is encouraging and notices when someone else is doing a job well and giving them praise. And so it's really important to be excited and to encourage one another consistently in all aspects of life, not just work and job related. In traditional academic mentoring, affirmation is also involved, but what's different about affirmation, feminist mentoring, is that achievement and events in one's personal life is as or more important than those in the career setting. So one thing that sets my relationship with Dessie apart is that she didn't just practice affirmation with me when I was her research assistant or as a student, but also in my goals and things happening in my life outside of work and school. So one major example that stands out in my mind is how excited she was for me to get engaged and married this summer. And I knew Dessie was genuinely excited and supportive of my decision to do this. And marriage is a really big example, but I also think affirmation in small ways was important in all of our relationships with one another. So Dessie was also really affirming as I worked towards applying to graduate school and taking time for myself and mental health. This was reciprocal though. I was excited when she got her new job at the University of Massachusetts and worked towards achieving different running goals. And I've also received affirmation from Kelly when our paths crossed. As we kind of mentioned earlier, I used to work in an office that Kelly oversaw and graduated from the college that she is an associate dean of. And so affirmation coming from her also was really meaningful to me.
Next, we want to talk about transparency, authenticity, and trust. And these are other key tenets of the feminist mentoring that we've identified. Being honest about meeting or not meeting goals, being honest about failing or making mistakes, and acknowledging that it's actually okay to make mistakes and admit when you're wrong. It's very important that we ensure that we are not trying to always play it off like we all have it together, because we don't. I want to focus on one example in particular that was really important as Dessie and I navigated through some things, and it involved an interaction that we had with the Research Integrity Office. Less so the office and more so the process. In this, Dessie was essentially approaching the office with information that she wanted to have looked into. I was at the time a stealth mentor. Other folks did not know who I was. They did not know what my role was. And I really was supposed to be considered quite anonymous in this process. However, it was found out what my role was. And then I was asked to participate in a meeting. And I was encouraged to discourage Dessie from sharing all of her collective information. But in my gut, I felt it was important to share. However, because I trusted these other people that I was talking with, I followed their lead. But in following that lead, I immediately lost Dessie's trust. And because we were very early in our relationship, she was not fully trusting of me yet. And so we had to work very hard to rebuild our trust at a time that it was really critical for her to trust me and to amplify her own voice and concerns. I really let her down. I immediately regretted my decision, and not surprisingly, and rightfully so, Dessie was incredibly angry with me. But I had to own up that I made a mistake, and what was most important in all of this was that I apologized to Dessie immediately, or as quickly as I was able to, rather than passing it off and saying, oh, don't worry about it, we'll work through it. So inch by inch, she and I worked to rebuild our trust, and honestly, it started with a simple apology. What's important to recognize that with being open and vulnerable, we created safe spaces for these important conversations to occur. We were essentially modeling that feminist mentoring in practice, and we were influencing each other to adopt and continue these practices amongst the three of us, as well as other people that we might interact with. In the end, what we continue to remind ourselves of is that we're all human and that we make mistakes. We're not perfect. It takes a great deal of courage to admit those mistakes and errors, but it also sends an incredibly strong message about your integrity, your values, and your own maturity. My apologies, I just need to get to my next slide. Next, we want to speak about feedback and correction and the importance of asking for feedback and making it really okay for someone else to give you feedback. Oftentimes, it's hard to hear what other people might say about the way in which you've interacted with them, but it is an incredibly rewarding experience if you're actually willing to listen carefully and accept that feedback and that constructive criticism. I'll share a couple of examples, and one of them actually makes me laugh just a little bit because Dessie and I have talked about it a fair bit. When she and I were first working with one another, we had a lot of documents that we were reviewing and a lot of documents that Dessie was working on writing. And I was essentially an editing body for her. As we got to editing it, one of the things that we quickly found out was that we definitely were not on the same page when it came to how we would review a document and provide feedback. I'm much more of a linear thinker, whereas Dessie is a big picture thinker. And needless to say, when I got in and reviewed the document and was editing to the nth degree, it was incredibly frustrating with Dessie, who was really just interested in kind of my overall sense of, was this in the right direction? What both of us recognized really quickly, though, because we both got frustrated, is that we stopped. I asked for feedback and I listened to Dessie, and in turn, Dessie also stopped and listened to feedback. And even now, a year later, when we're working on a document, we will set it up at the very beginning. What exactly are you looking for? What kind of feedback do you want, and how in-depth do you want me to be? For Sidney and Dessie, when giving feedback, one of the things that was really important to recognize is that for both of them, they previously had mentors who who essentially made them feel like they were being attacked of who they were as individuals. So one of the things that we worked very hard on was making sure whether the feedback was from me to Dessie, Dessie to Sidney, me to Sidney, that we all strive to put the person first. The feedback was about the work and not about the person, and it allowed for a productive dialogue and conversation, but also allowed us to figure out how best to work with one another given our respective different styles. Next, I just wanted to highlight the importance of having open and honest conversations. And we've sort of alluded to this already in some of the things that we shared, but being honest in how you are doing and welcoming honesty from others and being willing to have those difficult conversations is incredibly important. And it means honesty, not only in your professional spaces, but honesty with how you are doing as a person. I want to share a couple of examples here as well. The first one is when Sidney essentially moved and transitioned to Arizona for graduate school. One of the things that she acknowledged was that one of the things that Dessie recognized was that the quality of her work started to decline upon moving to Arizona. Well, not surprisingly, Sidney was under a great deal of stress, moving schools, moving into a new marriage, and had trouble concentrating and working. But because of the trust and the open and honest relationship that Dessie and Sidney had, Dessie felt comfortable raising her concerns with Sidney, and they were able to essentially work through some of their challenges that they were having. For Dessie and myself, I can vividly remember a conversation with Dessie where she asked me, "Doesn't that make you mad?" It did make me very mad, but what Dessie saw was someone who didn't show much emotion and was, I believe, relatively even a little bit unflappable. Because of my approach, Dessie's experience with me was that maybe I was not embracing the severity of the issue or the pain and discomfort that she was feeling. It was important that because I was not outwardly emotional, expressing my own anger and frustration, I needed to find other ways to assure her that I was deeply disturbed by the actions that were occurring and the impact that they were having on her health and wellness in particular. In all of these cases, we recognized the need to honor the lived experience of the other person, and we sought to understand each other's context. We were willing to be uncomfortable as we grew and became better communicators with one another. Even putting this presentation together, we had to navigate through our own differences about how we prepared and how we thought about different issues.
We also wanted to touch on talking about holistic support. That means not just mentoring and advising in a career, but also in personal life. So for example, when it came to making decisions about graduate school for myself, Dessie really helped me to think through not only the academic side of things, but also what it meant to move away from family and relationship dynamics and a whole bundle of other personal factors that involved moving from Michigan to Arizona. And that was really helpful because that wasn't something that was very present in a lot of my other mentoring relationships. And so that was very helpful for me. And in my relationship with Kelly, as she alluded to previously, I had a situation happen with an employer, and I was able to have a conversation with Kelly about that, and just kind of just the holistic, like all aspects of that situation. And she was able to help me walk through that. And I also know this holistic support was true of Dessie and Kelly's relationship. I know that they know a lot about many aspects of each other's lives and did a lot of things outside of MSU to care for one another, like going boxing or just engaging in other activities to support and care for each other in a more holistic way.
So another important component of feminist mentoring is that it be both reflective and reflexive. So reflecting as far as kind of what we're doing now. So reflecting on your mentorship, reflecting on your experiences, reflecting on different conversations or challenges, basically just spending a lot of time thinking about the things that you have lived through or been through. And I also think this is really important, as we mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, for informal mentorship, stealth mentorship, and even that episodic mentorship. Because a lot of times you don't necessarily see those as mentorship relationships until you take the time to look back on them. But I think even more important than being reflective is being reflexive. So that means using that reflection to change, adjust, or course correct. And I think a really good example of this is around something that is very stigmatized in the academy and in our relationship with mental health. So whenever I first encountered Kelly, she said something that was very, very powerful. I hadn't disclosed that I was struggling with anxiety or depression, but I'm pretty sure it was obvious to anyone that came within 3 feet of me. And one of the things that she said was, you know, I have struggled with mental health issues. I have taken medication, and that's okay. And that was something that was really powerful to me, because it wasn't just someone that I admired and looked at as a mentor. It was someone that is a very, very successful senior administrator in our university. And one of the things that was really helpful about that wasn't just for me personally, but whenever Sidney started going through her transition to Arizona, I saw a lot of the same things in her that I saw in myself. And we were able to have very, very transparent conversations about mental health and therapy and medication. And because I was able to reflect on that instance with Kelly, but also be reflexive and understand that it's okay to talk about mental health, to address mental health, to not be okay, that allowed me to be a better mentor to Sidney. And I think engage in some really important conversations that often we don't have.
So we want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the challenges, and we've alluded to these already within the presentation thus far. But let's talk a little bit about 4 important pieces that really kind of illuminated themselves throughout our experience. First of all is time. Quality mentoring is an investment. Hands down, it takes time and energy to mentor. And stealth mentoring is an even larger investment of time. I spent a lot of time, and others have spent time, where mentoring occurs at all hours of the day, on the weekends, and it is an investment in a way in which maybe you may not have ever expected it, but it's an incredibly rewarding investment when you are able to develop that relationship with the other individual. Communication was also challenging at times. It is hard communicating via text or having to switch to face-to-face. The 3 of us are from different generations, and we are each comfortable communicating quite differently. Even though you can't see me right now, one of the things that's incredibly important to me is I go off of a lot based on what I see of a person and their body language. But Dessie's preference was texting, and that was tough for me because I couldn't make that connection with her the way that I wanted to. So we had to figure out how to bridge those differences and allow us to communicate safely and freely in different formats. And we were able to recognize when, okay, it's all right for us to text about this, and when we needed to switch to a face-to-face environment. The power dynamic is there. It was there, and it's something that we had to work through across all 3 of us. And it worked both ways. One of the things that was interesting for us is that the position that I held, because I'm a senior associate dean, I was able to get answers to a lot of things a lot more quickly than maybe Dessie was. But Dessie also wanted me to be bolder and ask more questions. But I had to remember that I exist in a space where I will likely be in my position for an extended period of time, and I couldn't just walk in and blow the doors open in all kinds of different offices. There was a balance and a process that I had to walk through as well, and make sure that I was able to maintain colleagues and working relationships into the future. It was frustrating at times for Dessie because I couldn't address everything at the timeline in which she might have preferred it to happen. And then perspective taking. And I think this is typical no matter what kind of a relationship you're in, but it is hard to put yourself in someone else's shoes. We each have our own lived experiences, and we can never truly understand what those experiences are like for the other person. The best that we can do, though, is hope to understand and to ask questions, and then to try to appreciate what those experiences have been like for the other individual. So next we want to move on to lessons that we've learned. Lessons that I've learned in particular is that I've really become a better leader as a result of my interactions with Dessie and with Sidney. I've learned to listen better, I've learned to understand, and through all of that and those experiences that I've had, I've actually been able to work not only with Dessie and Sidney, but with others on concrete changes in policies and procedures for systematic change. I also was able to amplify my voice even larger. I found a voice because I felt so empowered to speak on behalf of students and to ensure that we were paying attention to our students. It was incredibly important to me that I had a really supported supervisor. He was phenomenal in encouraging me to make sure that I was doing the right thing and to follow my gut. But one thing that I also learned was that in being more vocal, in pushing for change, in some cases, I was not invited back to certain tables. And honestly, I'm okay with that because I still feel confident that the steps that we took for change were the right ones to take.
So I also learned a lot of lessons. So from Kelly, I learned a lot about how to play the game. And by that, I mean when to play the game, why, and times you should throw the whole damn rule book out the window. So a lot of navigating academic spaces is politics. I wish it wasn't that way, but it is. And so I learned a lot about how to enter rooms, how to be an effective communicator, when to really go to bat for something and when to just dial it back. What fight to pick and when. And I also learned a lot about why and thinking a lot more about the broader landscape of institutional politics, of different offices and different relationships. But I also learned that sometimes you just really have to do the right thing. There comes a time where there is integrity, and sometimes you just have to make your case and you have to be strong and you have to be vocal. And like Kelly said, understand that what you're doing is the right thing. And it might mean that you won't get an email back from that person or you're not getting back into that office again. But there is a delicate balance to these things. But I think ultimately I learned a lot from Kelly about there does come a point in which being a good person really does matter and other people will see your character. I also learned a lot about trusting my gut. This was something that Kelly gave me advice on from the beginning. And it was something that it took me a long time to listen to. I think, especially for people that are more junior in their career, there's this essence of really questioning yourself. Am I right? Am I wrong? Do I know what I'm talking about? And I think that this happens not just in doing science or research, but in other areas in the academy. And so more often than not, my gut was correct. And so really tuning in and listening to that was something that she actively helped me do and something that I use as kind of a guiding principle to this day. She also taught me a lot about being a woman in leadership. It means learning to compromise. And sometimes you have to decide what you're really going to focus on and what you're really going to argue for. But she also taught me that you have to be really careful with that because you can compromise to be effective and get things done, but you need to be careful that you're not sacrificing your values. With Sidney, I learned also quite a bit. I learned the importance of being transparent and willing to talk about tough things. As you can see from the timeline, I was clearly going through a lot of things in navigating the academy while I was also mentoring Sidney. And there were some of these things, because they were public, that I just could not hide. So I was really forced into this situation to really talk about and address tough stuff. And it was something that I grew more comfortable doing the more that I did it. Also, she taught me to think bigger and to consider other things that may be happening. I think we all are aware of the different things happening in our life that affect how we do research or how we teach or how we, participate in service. But I think there's a difference between thinking about that for yourself and thinking about it for other people. So, for example, when she made some mistakes at work, it wasn't just, what's going on at work. It's what else is happening here. Is she struggling in these new transitions she's made in her life? Is there something else going on? And I think that came back to really opening up that dialogue and figuring out what's happening and why certain things are occurring and having a really important, productive discussion about it. But I think probably one of the biggest things was that she taught me to respect my own boundaries. So I work with survivors of intimate partner violence. That's a tough gig. There's a lot of time where you're sitting with people recounting trauma. And it's something that I think in some ways I grew really used to over the years of doing it. And bringing Sidney into that world where it's not her research interest, I really saw the impact of our work on her. And seeing the impact of the work on her reminded me to check in with myself, to set firm boundaries about how much work we did and when, to be really, really intentional about debriefing. And so I think in really wanting to mentor and look out for her, it also reminded me that I need to look out for myself.
And so I also learned a lot too. The main thing I learned was I thought a lot about what kind of mentor I wanted to be in the future. I think now I have a much better idea of who I want to be for someone else. My relationship with Dessie and Kelly have really been beneficial and meaningful and have served as healthy examples of what mentor-mentee relationships look like. And I think without these relationships, I would be in a much different place, but also I would be a much different mentor in the future. I also learned a lot about balancing work, life, and school. School and work is a tough balancing act, and that's something I knew, but I had not seen very many people embody it consistently. They both taught me to work hard, but to take time for myself, to have fun, and to spend time with loved ones, because that's way more important than school or your career. They led by example, taking the occasional day off, decorating for holidays, practicing self-care, and spending time with spouses and family. Another thing I learned is that school is something I do and not who I am, and that you can love school and work and research a lot, but at the end of the day, it is just work and it is just school, and that messing up or failing in some aspect of school or work means that you failed and not that you are a failure. I also learned, as Dessie mentioned, just the value of transparency, and that being transparent allows others to also be transparent, which kind of just leads to an overall better relationship. Dessie regularly admitted mistakes, and it just taught me that fessing up and admitting when you're struggling is valuable, and it gave me permission to do that. I also learned a lot about research. I was engaged in a much different type of research before working with Dessie, and so I learned how to work with communities and participants in vulnerable populations. She led by example by being understanding and sympathetic to survivors, which helped me to understand how to do so, but also, like she mentioned earlier, to set boundaries. And I also learned a lot about self-care. This was something I was really terrible at. It was something I felt really guilty about, and so I just didn't do it. But the relationships I have with Dessie and Kelly helped me to learn how crucial self-care is for overall health. And so a year later, we're kind of past the point of really working with each other or having any sort of obligation to one another. But because of the feminist mentoring, the relationships that we had, we're still in each other's lives, supporting one another. And so since kind of all of this has happened, I have started my PhD at Arizona State. I am married, and another big change from last year at this time is my improved mental and emotional health. I'm still struggling a little bit with the challenges that come with all of these changes of moving and just transitioning in life, but especially given the state of COVID-19, and but I think that I'm in a much better place than I was a year ago. And it's been really helpful for me to be able to text Dessie or communicate with them or get on a Zoom call, and just check in and just communicate how we're struggling. And yeah, I'm in a much different, but much better place than I was a year ago.
Yeah, so I am Dr. Clark now, which is great. And I am a research collaboration coordinator at UMass. I would definitely say that in so many ways, I'm doing a lot better. Of course, COVID-19 is hard on so many things. There are days when it's hard to focus, where the anxiety kind of gets the best of me, as I know it does other people. But generally, I would say that I have improved my mental and emotional health. Being graduated and in a job that I really, really love has been super good for me. Also, I talk with Sidney and Kelley quite often. I work now in a position where I have a lot of interaction with different administrators at the university, and so I rely heavily on Kelley to help guide me through some of that as I continue to learn more about the ways institutions work. And I also keep in touch with Sidney, just staying present in her life to hear about things like graduate school and how things are going, but also to continue to tell her about my mistakes and my shortcomings. I know that as recently as last night, I sent Sidney a text message and said, because we're going to have this talk tomorrow, we're talking about transparency. Let me tell you about this really awful thing that happened today. And so I think definitely I'm better off for knowing both of them. And I use the things I've learned for both of them in my daily professional and personal life. And I also know that I still have them if I need them, which is a really great feeling to have.
And I have had the honor and privilege of working with both Sidney and Dessie and getting to know them better, both professionally and personally. And what that's allowed me to do is become a much stronger advocate and influencer, a better mentor and colleague, and a much more deliberate leader. One of the things that's really evident in the way in which I work in my professional career, especially the work that I do with students, is I'm actually able to ask better questions when students come in and are struggling. I'm able to understand better from their perspective because of what I've learned from Dessie and Sidney. Now, granted, I was an undergraduate and a graduate student, but things are different. And it was important for me to recognize how different things had become so that I could essentially become all of these different things. The nice thing about the position that I'm in right now is that my relationship with the two of them is not ending. It will continue. And I'm able to take the lessons that I've learned and the work that we've done and translate it to so many other people.
Okay, so at that point, we're going to take questions. I am going to stop sharing my screen so I can see people better. But yeah, so we would love to answer any questions or even just hear from you about your experiences or your thoughts, just kind of for the rest of our time together.
And Dessie, let me know if you want me to unmute anyone who wants to, but everyone should be able to turn on their video and speak.
Oh, I see a raised hand. I think Katie, you can unmute, I think.
Hi, yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really good. I have a question. You guys talked a lot about the mental health aspects, and I really appreciate that from what I'm going through right now. And I was wondering if, you know, that conversation about mental health and what's going on with you personally is much better just kept to like a mentor-mentee relationship. And like when is it appropriate to like communicate something with your supervisor for instance, with COVID, if I use sick time, for instance, I feel a little bit like, oh, maybe someone thinks I'm having symptoms, and it's not the case. It's a different issue, and I don't know how to decide when is it just TMI and when is it okay and like a good thing to do. So if anyone could speak to that, I would appreciate that.
I can start, and then Sidney and Kelly, you can jump in. I think that one of the things that is really important here, and we highlighted a little bit, but probably needed to say it even more explicitly, is the fact that disclosing things like that really, really depends on the relationship and the safety there. So unfortunately, there are people that may not respond well to disclosures about mental health. I know that's been my experience in the past. One of the things that was really important in our relationship is there was this trust here, and there was this openness, especially from Kelly, to really talk about mental health in a really concrete and explicit way. I would say that if you feel like you're in a situation where it's safe to disclose mental health issues or concerns to your supervisor or your mentor, then I think it's something that's good to do. I think it opens up great conversations, and I think that it's something that allows someone to really know where you're at. I know that even in my supervising role of Sidney, understanding what was going on was really helpful for me to understand kind of the situations that were arising in her work and work quality. And so I think that that's something that really depends, but I do feel like it is an important conversation if you are willing to have it. I also will just say about the COVID symptoms thing, it really is nobody's business why you're taking sick time. If you want to disclose why you're taking sick time, that's fine. But I think that one of the things that people should just remember is that you only have to share as much as you want to. And so I can understand the fear of people worrying about, or you being worried about people perceiving that as COVID-19 symptoms, but also I think, you don't owe anyone your truth or your voice. And Kelly and Sidney, maybe you want to follow that up a little bit.
So Katie, I really appreciate the question that you have, because I think a lot of people kind of try to figure out how to navigate through that. One of the things that I have to recognize is the position that I sit in. Because I am an administrator, I have a lot easier time being able to acknowledge mental health for myself. But I also likewise have a responsibility to encourage conversations at other levels about mental health. So I work with a set of dean and directors and chairs and school directors, and part of my job is to destigmatize those conversations and help ensure that we are regularly having those discussions so that that trickles down into all aspects of the academy. Sidney, I want to make sure you get a chance to chime in too.
Yeah, I would echo what Dessie and Kelly said about if, it depends on maybe the relationship you have with that person or your comfort level in sharing something like that. But I would also just say that you might be surprised of their reaction. Maybe it's something that they've struggled with in the past, or maybe it's something they have experience with. And so I always think if it's something you're comfortable with, I think there's a lot of benefit to sharing something like that, because I think there's a lot of benefit for you, but I also think there's benefit for other people. And I think little actions like that lead to bigger changes. And I think just being a person who, if you're comfortable, is willing to disclose that and to share that, just works away at that stigma of mental health. And so, I would say that I appreciate your question, and that it's kind of a complicated, and we don't really have an answer, but I think it just depends on your relationship and your comfort, but that's what we have.
Thanks a lot. That was really helpful. I appreciate it.
Hi, this is Heidi. I'm supposed to be tech support, but I was really appreciating your presentation, and I have a question. So my job, I work at the Institute for Research on Women and Gender at U of M, and I'm thinking a lot about this like informal and stealth mentoring model that you talk about. I think it's really great. And I also appreciate that you acknowledge that like certain people are just excluded from that because they're not tapped in. So do you have any recommendations for like how maybe an institute like mine or you know, as a staff person or even a, you know, something I can encourage my director to do, like how to sort of create conditions for that type of informal and stealth mentoring so we can bring people in who are otherwise excluded from those networks?
Kelly, I see you nodding, so I feel like you have something to say, but I can follow up after you.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, it's a really great question, Heidi, and thanks for being here today. I think one of the things that I would offer on this is that it is the value of the culture of the organization dictates a lot. And so part of it, I think, is the opportunity to sit with the individuals who are sitting in positions of power and to have the conversations about the importance of mentoring, informal mentoring, formal mentoring, stealth mentoring, and that it's not bad. It's actually good and it's productive for the whole community and for the whole organization. I'm going to just share with you my own experience with a stealth mentor. I actually called her my secret mentor, and she still is. The importance of having that individual be available to me at a moment's notice, navigating through processes, but also really having a good handle on the institution and the dynamics of the institution. It allowed me as an administrator to actually be able to advance in my role much quickly because I had someone who was uninvolved with my day-to-day work, but somebody who really understood the institution and helped me navigate it a lot more quickly than me just kind of tripping through it and potentially wasting a lot of precious time on moving certain issues forward. Dessie?
Yeah, so I think I would follow up on that too. And I think, you know, I was situated as a graduate student and now kind of as a staff member. I think one of the things that's important too is creating conditions in which people from different status levels can mix. So the way that things work in an institution is the people that have power are largely at the top. And I think one of the things that was helpful, and, you know, Kelly was kind of the focus of this presentation, but there were other people, administrative roles, that act as my mentor in stealth and informal ways. And I think that was because I was able to get around them and in front of them. And so I think that if there's a willingness from the people that have power to mingle in mixers or to just really sit and listen to what students have to say or staff have to say, then you can start to create those connections. But I really think it does take, especially for informal and stealth mentoring to be super effective, it really does take blending people from different positions at the university, because some of those people have, you know, social and political capital that they can use in ways that maybe other students or peers can't.
Yeah, I'd also add, kind of going off of what Dessie said about just like mixing people that are kind of in different places and different positions. I'm now a graduate student at Arizona State, and COVID is a weird time and a lot of things are online, but something that the School of Sustainability does is every single Friday we have just 1 hour at 11:30 where people can anyone can hop on. Staff people are always on there, faculty members are always on there, students you can just drop in, you can come for 15 minutes, you can come for however long you want, but it's just kind of, it's weird because it's online, or different because it's online. It's different than it would be in person, but I think just having, and there's no agenda, it's just anyone can talk about anything, whatever's happening that week. I think those kind of mixers and opportunities are really important for maybe fostering that.
Thank you all so much. That's really helpful.
Hi there. I'm Heather, she, her. I'm a feminist sociologist, and I'm really super interested in this paradox of, right, we're in this institution, we understand how it works, and we have to somehow both socialize and support new people and be successful in our own careers, and also critique the institution. And try to transform it. So I'm just forever curious about how people manage that. And I just wonder if anybody wants to talk about that a little bit.
Well, I can start if that's all right. So one of the things that I've taken the opportunity, the position that I hold, to be able to have a stronger voice. So this is not exactly related to this particular example, but I'll share with you when MSU was entering into the pandemic back in March, there was a significant amount of frustration around how a couple of things were being handled, especially related to communication. And I thought, what the heck, what do I have to lose? Let's embrace this position of power. And every single space I walked into, I said the same thing. And I just kept repeating it to different people because I knew I was speaking with upper level administrators. I was speaking to my peers. I was speaking to people in the departments. And the more I kept reiterating it, and I'm not saying I'm the only one that was doing it, but the more it started to become a common message I heard from all kinds of other people. So what we did is we started this mass of voices, and it's really difficult to not pay attention when all of these voices were saying the same thing.
Yeah, I think honestly, it's a really tricky answer, and I don't think that what I'm going to say is perfect. I actually think in some ways it's part of the problem. But I think one of the things that we really learned was that we had to figure out what people would respond to. And it turns out, as you would expect, that administrators don't respond to what you're doing is really harmful to people, or what you're doing is actually oppressive or rooted in white supremacy or any other kind of privilege. But what they do respond to is evidence. So we spent a lot of times when I wanted to sit in a room saying, this policy makes people feel really terrible for XYZ. And instead, we really went at it here are the best practices, here's why this can be problematic. And we spent a lot of time documenting, hundreds and hundreds of pages of not only what the problems were with different policy and procedure, but also the way that they could be changed in order to make things better or improve. Now, one of the really big cons of this is that we basically did people's jobs for them. Instead of having them rewrite the policy, we were walking in there with very concrete suggestions on what to do. And so I think that is something that, again, it kind of comes back to where should the burden fall and things like that. But on certain things, I think we cared enough that even though we definitely sat in rooms and were like, we should not be writing the policy for X office, this is totally not our job, we still spent the time doing it because we cared enough about what we had seen happen to me and other people that we really wanted to make sure that these key things were changed. But I think that because we are operating within these institutions, kind of like you say, there are times where you kind of have to play the game and, and do things that you shouldn't have to do or probably don't want to do, because unfortunately, people don't necessarily react well to like, that's not fair, that's not okay, that's really oppressive. They need a little bit more hand-holding than that, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's interesting how much of this is sort of like figuring out how to organize, as in like social change. It's what it is, right? But all that time that folks like us spend on that is sometimes detrimental to our own actual careers. And then how do we get into the positions of power, right? It's like this complicated thing, but this commitment, I think, that so many of us have to making change and to making this better is what keeps us doing this work.
Yeah. Heather, one other thing I just want to share with you, and I think it's related in this conversation, and it's something that, so I'm in the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources, and we have a newer dean. He's been with us for less than 5 years at this point. He walked in to his position, and one of his initiatives was around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I share that with you because it was very significant in terms of some of the things that he was very insistent that the leadership would engage in for culture change within the college. So we actually spent almost 2 years, and it was his entire leadership team, the deans, assistant deans, associate deans, the chairs, people who had significant influence and power positions within the college participated in some extensive training. And what has resulted is there's a lot of work that we've been doing on policies and procedures within the college, but also moving us away from it has to rise to the level of breaking a law before somebody is willing to say that's bad. And that has been incredibly important for us because it's resetting the norm. It is saying, wait a second, you don't have to have this as a case that is held in front of the Office of Institutional Equity. It's okay to call out bad behavior for bad behavior, and really starting to empower more people to say, it's okay to do that, and here's how you do it and how you need to document it.
Yeah, and just to even briefly expand upon that, I think one of the places that we got to was me and Kelly really wanted to reform the university, right? Some of these offices are really problematic, but we hit a point where we realized, okay, this isn't working. We are fighting a giant. Why don't we start where we can? And Kelly said many times, okay, the other colleges, whatever, I'm going to make sure that the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources is the leader in this, that we're going to set the example, we're going to reform this space, and then everyone else is going to have to catch up. And I think that made it a lot more manageable. And I think that could happen at a department or program level too.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. Layers of things.
I want to really thank Dessie, Sidney, and Kelly for their time and expertise and sharing, really openly and, in the spirit of vulnerability, right? The challenges that they've encountered with doing feminist mentoring, the lessons learned, and I hope everyone has come away with some important, takeaways.